Okay, this is Mexico Part 3 on citizen society and the state civil society in Mexico. So we'll begin by talking about the social cleavages, and we've talked about this a little bit in class already. One of the biggest divisions is between the urban and rural populations. So under pre-party rule, Mexico was mostly rural, and as we talked about in class, patronage was really important, and clientelism and the patronage system is when the political party in power, so the ruling party, gives out resources or government contracts or land to supportive businesses or supportive individuals. So what this meant was that peasants were really dependent upon the party for resources that they needed, and also corporations benefited from the party as well. Today, Mexico has shifted, and about 75 to 78% of the country is living in an urban area. The literacy rate is about 90%. So education is a guaranteed right for all Mexican citizens. We also talked about the north-south divide. The north tends to be more prosperous. It's much more involved with trade with the United States. It's more industrialized. The maquiladoras are located in the north, and that encourages migration from south to north. The north also tends to be more middle class, and people are more likely to have higher education in the north. The south is the opposite. So the south is typically predominantly Amerindians, with lower incomes and less educational opportunities. So we're starting to see some challenges to this with the new president. Obrador has discussed, and campaigned on the idea that inequality is really negatively impacting the country, and that was one of his main tenets in his campaign. So he's trying to address the high economic inequality that exists. So you are beginning to see some growth in the middle class, and it'll be interesting to see how that continues under his leadership. Again, the Mestizo-Amerindian division is an important social cleavage. About 30% think of themselves as indigenous or Amerindian, and they're more likely to live in marginalized rural areas of the country and to live in poverty. So think about which cleavages are coinciding here. Remember, cleavages can be coinciding or cross-cutting. We see quite a bit of coinciding cleavages here, so cleavages that sort of compound, right? So they are multiple divisions that align the same way. So the north-south divide, the urban-rural divide, the Mestizo-Amerindian divide, all of them are coinciding because the same groups are divided in all three of those issues. That's going to have important political ramifications. So in class, we'll talk about political parties, but each of these groups in each regional part of the country draws support or supports different political parties. So that's going to play out in the political system as well. So again, under pre-party rule, that patron-client system was very strong. As the country became more modern and moved away from import substitution, you saw you saw less dependency upon the party for resources. So Mexico does have some examples of some protests. So people, getting out and speaking up against the government. Some of the more notable ones were people rising up, students rising up against what they saw as a lack of opportunities for them. So there were student protests in 1968, and the government actually responded in a really interesting way. So as opposed to in China, where we saw Tiananmen Square, where you had students rising up and calling for more democratization, and the government responded by bringing in the military and killing the students and then covering up the incident. In 1968, those same student protests calling for more democratization, speaking out against inequalities, the government actually responded by accommodating the protesters and bringing in students into advisory roles in the presidential administration. So co-optation is this idea that protesters would be included, their voices would be heard in the political process. And this helps to quell future uprisings. When you get a voice, you get a seat at the table, this helps to bring about peace to the situation. One of the more notable uprisings occurred in 1994 in Chiapas, which is a southern state of Mexico. It's a very poor southern state. where Amerindians were feeling ignored following NAFTA. NAFTA had very detrimental effects, especially on poor communities and farmers. So at that time, Vicente Fox was the president, and he attempted to incorporate the Zapatistas into the government. So kind of the same response here. So the government doesn't just shut down protests. The government instead tries to bring about more involvement in the political process. As a result, the federal government now also makes sure to supply electricity and water to villages in this poor community. That was one of the issues. Although this remains a major problem, the lack of access to water is something that AMLO also addressed in his presidential campaign. The fact that there's very uneven distribution of clean water. So the federal government made sure to provide it for these areas in Chiapas, but that didn't continue to the rest of the country. Another famous protest was in 2006. There was a protest in Oaxaca where a teacher strike demanding more pay and eventually devolved into a protest against the election and against what they saw as authoritarian rule. And they eventually, the teachers were very successful in demanding the resignation of the governor of Oaxaca at the time. So very interesting here what the trend is, and what's important to take away from this is that Mexico does not come in and violently respond to all protests that happen, although the military does have some history of suppressing some speech, which we'll see in class with the Part 2 slideshow. There are a lot of examples of the government responding more favorably to protests. The other thing with political participation is voting behavior. So before the 1990s, the pre-party controlled the elections themselves on a local, state, and national level, which helped to ensure that they maintained control at all levels. Voting rates were really high because you had to come out and show that you had supported the party in order to get the resources that you needed because of that patron-client system. Since the 1930s, there technically have been competing parties, although there were really no options until 2000. In 1994, turnout was about 78%. Now they hover right around 63%. That's true for the 2018 election as well, where turnout was about 63.8%. It was a little bit up from what it was in 2012, but, this is by tenths of a point, so it's not significant. So during the pre-party rule, interest groups were part of the corporatist system, which we talked about in class, this idea that the party themselves decides which interest groups get a say in government. And so the interest groups were divided into three sectors: labor, peasants, and the middle class. And those were some of the different groups are examples of the types of groups that could give input. So even under the pre-party, what this shows is that civil society has existed. It's something that the government values, is getting input from outside organizations. Today, the political parties are the primary civil society organizations, especially in urban Mexico. So the political parties themselves, they try to, this is a recruitment effort as well. They go out and they try to get support from the community through sponsoring sports clubs, youth activities, celebrations, which is really kind of funny when you think about that idea. If you imagine the Republican or the Democratic parties going out and sponsoring youth sports, it kind of gives you this impression that in Mexico, the parties are viewed not just as a political entity, but also as a community entity that's pretty essential to everyday life. So one of the things that helped bring about PRI's initial downfall was when they sort of got away from this. So businessmen at the time felt like they weren't being incorporated into the government system, they weren't being heard, and started to speak out against the party when they felt like it wasn't addressing their needs. The other thing that's interesting is, we mentioned that Mexico is 83% Catholic. In recent decades, we've seen a growth of Protestantism, which demonstrates that civil society is open. People are able to go to whatever church they choose. We saw in the Constitution of 1917, there's not a joining of church and state. There's a very distinct separation between the two. And there's a freedom of religion there, even though culturally most people practice Catholicism. We're seeing a shift where more people are practicing Protestantism. And then finally, NGOs, non-governmental organizations, professional organizations tied to a specific trade or a specific business or corporation are very common. There's especially around Mexico City. So if you're asked to compare civil society in Mexico with any of the other countries we've studied, Mexico's civil society is much more open, much more free, much more active than what we've seen in China or Russia. It's much more along the lines of what we've seen in the UK, where people are able to form voluntary groups and protest at will. And then I guess my very last point is about unions, that unions are very powerful, especially those that are still associated with the pre-party. Unions are a very common and typical group for people to join. And that will wrap it up. And this will not be on the quiz on Thursday. It will just be parts 1 and 2, but you will want to know this information for the test next week.